I'm only going to speak for about 15 minutes because I wanted as much time as possible for Q&A because I sense that there hasn't been much so far, and also because I'm always very excited about hearing other people's views and questions. But let me start by making a few remarks. The first, by the way, is that I'll talk a little about my recent book. It's always rather difficult to understand another country, let alone another continent or another culture. There are things you have in common, there are things which seem bizarre when you look at them from outside, and there are things that look recognizable, there are things that rhyme. There are an enormous number of similarities between where I'm from and where most of you are from, and an enormous number of differences too. I've been in the States all week, spoken at a campus, and was on the West Coast at the beginning of the week, and I had one of those disassociation moments in San Francisco when I had been in my, I think, second day in the city, and I just noticed that absolutely everywhere there seemed to be posters advertising deliveries services for marijuana. And I thought, this is interesting, because if there's one thing it seems to me that San Francisco doesn't need, it's easier access to marijuana. More of it, just so that people who smoke it don't even have to go down the street. But there are lots of similarities between our societies as well, and one of the, I suppose, most gratifying things since The Strange Death of Europe came out in June here in the US is the number of people who have come over to me and written to me from America, from Canada, from Australia, and said, this book is about us, isn't it? And perhaps I could start by just saying a little about what it is about, and you'll get some of the resonances. The Strange Death of Europe centres on the 2015 migration crisis, which you all remember was the moment when Angela Merkel massively exacerbated an already existing problem by announcing unilaterally that the external and internal borders of Europe were basically dissolved. In a single act, the mass movement of people that had been going on for decades sped up exponentially, so that Germany in a single year took in an additional 2% of its population, that Sweden took in an additional almost 3% of its population. This is all part of a pattern, I say, that has been going on for many decades, and just like those previous decades, what happened after the 2015 crisis was that politicians and the media found excuses to justify something that would have happened anyway. So, for instance, German citizens and others were told that this mass migration, millions of people into Europe, would be a net economic gain for their society, that it would enrich their society. Now, actually, all of the studies that I've gone over in this show that, at best, most such migration cannot be called to be any kind of economic gain. A study in Britain showed that over a 15-year period, migrants took out 95 billion more in services than they put in taxation. And of course they would. If you go to another country, you don't speak the language, you don't have the skills, it's going to be a very long time before you've put in anything into the welfare system remotely like the amount that you and your family will have taken out. But this is one of the arguments that are made. And by the way, just as in all of the decades after the war, so in the post-2015 moment, the governments that came up with these explanations had to hedge around the facts, so that just like the Labour government after 1997, they had to pretend that the average migrant was a Luxembourgian hedge funder. And this is just one of the lies that gets told to the people. Because once that one is shot down, once, for instance, you notice that the number of people who've been added to Germany's welfare bill in the last year is almost exactly the number of the people who came in 2015. Once you go over that lie, you get to another one, which the German people and others were told, which is that we are an ageing population, we are a greying population, and that therefore we need obviously, to bring people in to keep us and our society into the standards to which we've become accustomed. Of course, this argument always ignores one extraordinary thing which none of the politicians ever seem to be able to recognize, which is the startling fact that migrants get old as well. It's, amazingly enough, it's not just us Europeans who suffer the aging process. Who knew? But of course, if you do believe in that idea, that you need to keep on bringing people to keep yourself in the custom that you're now used to, you get what I describe as the pyramid problem in migration. You keep having to bring in more and more people all the time to keep yourselves in that a sustainable societal moment. But so if you, once you get the one of, well, okay, maybe they don't make us richer, maybe the aging population thing doesn't work, you get to another one, which is diversity. It doesn't matter if we're financially poorer. It doesn't matter because we're so much more culturally rich. Now, I should say that there is something in this. What society, Europeans certainly wouldn't do, is what society doesn't want to know as much of interest and culture as the world has to offer. Who doesn't want to know as much about the world and about the ideas of the world as possible? But, of course, the first person from, for instance, India to bring Indian cuisine into the UK does an interesting service, vimms up the local cuisine. It's not the case that the next 100 Indians who come in, for instance, bring 100 times more interesting cuisine. It's not the case that the first Sudanese poet who enters the UK massively brings interest to your country, and that the next 1,000 people from Sudan continue to just bring ever richer versions of the poetry of Sudan. And by the way, please don't ask me to name my favourite Sudanese poet. But this is just a part of that life. They also say, you also notice, by the way, that this is always a one-way street. Not once in my adult life have I heard anybody say that the thing that Eritrea needs most is an injection of Welshmen. that they just could do with some Welsh cooking. Or singing. Nobody says this. Nobody says, as Mark Stein and I were saying in the conversation recently, nobody says, the thing that the Somalis really need is a bit more Bach. I actually think it'd be nice for them if they had a bit more Bach. But nobody thinks that's an appropriate way to say it. But Europeans are told there's something hollow at our heart, as if we in Europe, the culture of Dante and Goethe and Bach, has some kind of diminishment, something hollow at its centre that needs filling by the world. And then you get to another stage in this, which is, okay, maybe it doesn't make you richer. Maybe the ageing population thing does fall apart. Maybe the diversity thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. Or, as I put it at one point in my book, maybe we have to just do an agreement that this is a quid pro quo. We have a bit more gang rape and beheading than we used to have, but then there's a wider range of cuisines, so who's to... Life's all swings and roundabouts, so... But then you get to the last stage of that, which is the one that politicians now say and speak to us about, which is, okay, maybe none of these things are the case. Well, suck it up. This is globalization. This is going to happen anyway. This is a hell of a way to speak to the general public about their and their children's future. And it is only said, once again, to
that role to a select group of people. Are you not, for many, many, many people, giving up that personal responsibility? And therein lies the entire problem. You cannot give away personal responsibility for your own protection to someone else, for your own community's protection to anyone else. This is why we're living with a militarized police force that constitutes a standing army among the population right now.
It's a completely dysfunctional, codependent, relationship, and
sure.
And the problem always keeps coming back to the same thing, is our disconnection from natural law and fitness. And it's like, once we're disconnected from natural law and how it works, like the sickness is just going to constantly keep perpetuating itself.
This is wanting to be taken care of and protected. So, the nurturing and caring dynamic is the motherly aspect of a familial dynamic. And then the protective aspect is the masculine or fatherly dynamic of within the familial system. And this is what government always props itself up as, the surrogate family. This is what order followers see the cult of government as. That's why they even join this cult, and that's why they obey its dictates. They actually believe that government is trying to take care of people like a family. Okay, when in fact all it wants to do is control. It is a dysfunctional relationship.
Right,
it's a relationship based on masters and slaves, on authority, and those who must obey it, which is a master and a slave. And people don't understand it as such, and that's because in some form, the real family dynamic has been destroyed, and people have been let down by that family dynamic, and so they are searching subconsciously. Is ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It's like, if you don't understand that we're facing a infinitely larger threat from government itself than any kind of polarized creation that, the intelligence agencies of this country created decades ago, and, they blew up, and, hey, you could argue whether they got off their leash or whatever, but you know what? We made that mess, that could very well come home to roost for us, because so many people hate our involvement in all these other countries and our building of an empire abroad, through military bases in over 100 countries. Who wouldn't? Who likes a bully like that? No one does. These countries don't want our protection either. We're involved in everybody else's business, thinking that we have some kind of a moral right to go and do that. We don't. And, this is what somebody like Christie wants to continue to perpetuate. And I just think he's an extraordinarily dangerous individual who is akin to people who, built the Nazi society and the SS order. It's no different. And anybody that has this mentality has a mentality that is similar to Nazi worship. It's the same basic thing. And I don't care what people want to say about that. They can go and buy into this whole revisionist nonsense about how Hitler was such a great guy. They don't even understand the occult roots of Nazism. They don't understand the occult roots of all totalitarian societies. I know who lays behind the so-called enthroned powers that, are out there visibly, but they're just puppets on strings. They're just dogs on leashes. Occasionally one of them will get off the leash or get off the string and think they're acting on their own, and then their puppet masters will try to deal with them. But the whole point is they don't look behind the corridors of power to the occult powers that lie behind the scenes. A priest class that is waging an ideological war, that is waging a war against the human spirit, lies behind the political and financial powers. Okay? This priest class you have to look at them as a dark cabal of ancient psychologists that have taken ancient knowledge that has existed for thousands of years. I would make the claim it has existed for tens of thousands of years. And they're taking all of that knowledge that they have accrued throughout the centuries about how the human mind works. They're keeping it back as much as possible from other people, or discouraging them from looking into it. And as a result of that knowledge differential, they're wielding a power differential over the general public. Because just think about it from this perspective. I give people this example all the time, okay? If I was the most advanced psychologist living on the planet Earth today, no one in the world knew more about the human mind than I did. Okay, let's just say. And I were of the mindset to want to wield that kind of knowledge in a negative way over someone who had never looked into psychology for a moment in their lives, did not understand anything about how the human mind worked, how the human motivations and desires worked,